The end came not with a shout, but with the dry rustle of paper. Alara stood in the hall of the house she had been born in, a space that smelled of her grandmother's lemon polish and her grandfather's pipe tobacco, and listened to the clinical finality in her uncle's voice. At 24, she was the last echo in a home that had once been loud with life. Her parents were a faded photograph on the mantel, taken by a seaside she couldn't remember. Her grandfather, Silas, was a more recent and visceral absence, a silence in the workshop out back, a coldness in the leather of his favorite chair. He had been her anchor, her teacher, the one who had shaped her hands and her mind. Marcus, her mother's brother, cleared his throat. He was a man made of sharp angles and soft excuses, his hands uncalloused, his gaze perpetually fixed on some distant ledger. He had inherited the farm, the house, everything. Alara had inherited only the memories it held. "The papers are signed, Alara," he said, avoiding her eyes. "The new owners take possession on the 1st of the month. That gives you 10 days. He slid a thin envelope across the hall table. It made a soft, scratching sound against the polished wood. "This is a final settlement. I think you'll find it's quite generous, all things considered." She did not pick it up. She looked at his face, a study in practiced detachment, and felt a profound, hollow calm settle in her chest. There was no room for grief. It had been cauterized by the sheer administrative coldness of her eviction. She had known this was coming. Marcus had been talking about liquidating assets and moving forward since the day after Silas's funeral. She did not cry. She did not plead. Her grandfather had taught her that some forces, like weather or the turning of the earth, were not subject to appeal. Human greed, she was learning, was one of them. Silas had been a surveyor and a stonemason, a man who believed the world could be understood through careful measurement and honest work. He had taught her not with lectures, but with labor. He had put a carpenter's pencil in her hand before a doll, showing her how to read the grain of a piece of oak. He taught her to mix mortar, to feel its consistency with her fingers, to know when it was right by the pull on the trowel. He'd shown her how to use an adze to shape a beam, the rhythmic thud and curl of the wood, a language she learned to speak fluently. He'd taught her to read the stars, to find true north, not just with a compass, but with the slant of the sun and the growth of moss on a rock. He believed competence was a form of prayer, and that self-reliance was the only true inheritance. His most treasured tool, the one he had given her on her 16th birthday, was a plumb bob. It was not a simple thing of lead or steel, but a heavy, dense piece of brass, turned on a lathe to a perfect, satisfying point. It was warm to the touch, and around its widest part, Silas had painstakingly engraved the constellations of the northern sky. "Everything wants to find its center, Ellie," he had told her, his voice rough as granite. "People, stones, houses. This little fellow doesn't lie. It always points to the truth. Down. No matter how crooked the world seems, down is always down. You hang your life on that, you'll never be truly lost." That plumb bob was in the pocket of her canvas jacket now, its weight a familiar comfort against her hip. It was the only thing of value she truly owned. The house, the land, the memories. They were all being sold for a price she would never know, to people she would never meet. She finally reached out and took the envelope. Inside were 3 $100 bills, a final settlement for a lifetime. She nodded once to her uncle, a gesture of acknowledgement, not agreement. Then she turned and walked out of the hall, through the kitchen, and out the back door, leaving him alone with his profitable emptiness. She went to the workshop first. It still held his scent, a mix of sawdust, machine oil, and sweet, dry pine resin. She didn't take the big tools, the table saw, or the drill press. They were fixtures, part of the property now. She packed a small, sturdy canvas satchel with the things that were extensions of her own hands, a dovetail saw with a handle worn smooth, a set of sharp chisels, a block plane, a framing hammer, a leather roll of drafting tools, and a small, brass-bound compass. She wrapped the plumb bob in an oilcloth and placed it carefully in the bottom of the bag. She added a change of clothes, a loaf of bread from the kitchen, and a canteen of water. She did not look back at the house. To look back was to invite a grief she could not afford. For 3 days, she walked. She had no destination, only a direction, west, away from the soft, green hills of her childhood and toward the high, arid plains her grandfather had sometimes spoken of, a land of harsh beauty and unforgiving truths. The $300 felt like a pittance, an insult, but it was also all she had. It had to be enough. She slept in haylofts and on the sheltered side of rock outcroppings, the stars her only roof. The journey stripped away the last vestiges of the girl she had been, leaving a core of quiet determination. She arrived in a town called Redemption, a place whose name seemed like a cruel joke. It was a single dusty street, baked by a relentless sun, lined with false-fronted buildings whose paint had been scoured away by wind and time. In the general store, buying a small bag of dried beans and flour, she heard 2 old men talking by the pot-bellied stove, their voices dry as the dust outside. "County's selling off the cook's folly for back taxes," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. $150 for the whole worthless plot." The other man chuckled, a sound like stones rattling in a can. "More like paying them to haul it away. 90 years that circle's been sitting out there. Cursed ground. Nothing's ever grown there but rocks and regret." Elara paused, her hand on a sack of flour. "Cook's folly?" she asked, her voice quiet. The first man turned to look at her, his eyes a pale, watery blue. He took in her dusty clothes, the worn satchel, the exhaustion etched on her face. "Just an old story, miss. A wagon train, the Thorn Expedition, they called it. Got caught in a freak blizzard back in the 40s, the 1840s. Every last one of them froze solid in a single night. All that's left is their wagons, circled up like they're still waiting for a fire that went out 90 years ago. The cook's wagon is in the middle, hence the folly." Something stirred in Elara, a flicker of an idea, desperate and illogical. A circle of wagons, a piece of land nobody wanted. She thought of the plumb bob in her bag, its unerring point toward the center. "Where is the county clerk's office?" she asked. The clerk was a man named Peterson, with a shiny, bald head and a permanently skeptical expression. He looked at the young woman standing before him, her face smudged with dust, and his skepticism deepened. When she asked about the Thorn Expedition plot, it curdled into outright amusement. "You don't want that land, miss," he said, leaning back in his creaking chair. "It's alkali soil, no water, miles from anywhere. People say the ghosts of the pioneers still wander out there on cold nights. It's a waste of good money." "How much?" Elara asked, her voice steady. $150, he said, a smirk playing on his lips. He clearly expected her to balk, to walk away. He was enjoying this, the little drama of a drifter with delusions of land ownership. Elara reached into her pocket and pulled out the envelope from her uncle. She laid one $100 bill and one $50 bill on the scarred wooden counter. The crispness of the bills seemed out of place in the dusty office. Peterson's smirk faded. He stared at the money, then back at her. He shrugged, as if to say it was her funeral. He pulled a thick, yellow deed from a filing cabinet, dipped a pen in an inkwell, and began to fill it out. The scratch of the nib was the only sound in the room. "Name?" he grunted. "Elara," she said. "Just Elara." He finished with a flourish, sanded the ink dry, and pushed the document across the counter. "All yours," he said, sweeping the money into a drawer. "The cook's folly. Good luck with the ghosts." The situational irony was thick enough to taste. He was mocking her for buying a piece of forgotten history, unaware that he was selling a future. She walked for another day, following the clerk's crude map, the deed a stiff rectangle in her satchel. The landscape grew harsher, the ground harder. Finally, she crested a low rise and saw it. The folly. It was exactly as the old man had described, and yet so much more desolate. In a shallow, windswept basin, a dozen wagons stood in a silent, perfect circle. Their wood was bleached to the color of bone, their canvas covers long since surrendered to the wind, leaving only skeletal frames reaching for a sky that offered no comfort. They looked like the fossilized remains of some great, circular beast. A profound and aching loneliness washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. The sheer weight of the tragedy that had unfolded here was a physical presence. This wasn't just abandoned, it was forsaken. For a long moment, despair was a tangible thing, a cold hand gripping her heart. She had spent almost everything she had on a graveyard. But then her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. "Find your center, Ellie." She took a deep breath, the dry, sage-scented air filling her lungs. She shifted the satchel on her shoulder and walked down into the basin, her boots crunching on the gravelly soil. The circle was larger than it had looked from the ridge. At its heart was a wide, stone-lined fire pit, filled with 90 years of dust and debris. Standing apart from the other wagons, slightly more intact and built of sterner stuff, was the chuck wagon. Its boxy, practical shape spoke of sustenance and shelter. It would be her home. She spent the rest of the afternoon making the chuck wagon habitable. She swept out the thick layers of dust, the desiccated husks of insects, and the tiny bones of mice who had sought shelter and found their end. The wood was sound, seasoned by decades of dry heat and bitter cold. There was a small, built-in bunk, a fold-down work surface, and dozens of small drawers and compartments, all empty. It was a small space, but it was solid. It was hers. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, a chill crept into the air. She needed a fire. She turned her attention to the central pit. It was a proper hearth, built with care, the stones flat and well-fitted. She began clearing out the debris, scooping it away with a piece of rusted metal she'd found. As she worked her way down to the original stone floor of the pit, her fingers brushed against one of the large, flat hearthstones near the center. It was different. The others were rough, their surfaces pitted by ancient fires and decades of weather. This one was smoother, and it seemed to sit differently. She pushed on it. It shifted, just a fraction of an inch, with a faint grinding sound. The other stones were locked in place, embedded in the hard-packed earth. This one was separate, an anomaly. Her heart began to beat a little faster. This was not a random placement. This was intentional. She retrieved her satchel from the wagon. She took out a small pry bar and one of her grandfather's sturdiest masonry chisels. Kneeling by the stone, she worked the tip of the pry bar into the thin crack around its edge. It was heavy, a solid piece of granite nearly 3 inches thick. She put her weight into it, her muscles straining. Slowly, grudgingly, the stone began to lift. She worked the chisel in underneath, using it as a lever. With a final, grunting effort, she heaved the hearthstone over. It fell onto the dirt with a heavy thud. Beneath it was not earth. It was a dark, square void, carefully lined with smaller, tightly fitted stones. And nestled inside that void was a bundle wrapped in dark, oiled canvas. It was heavy, dense. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached in and lifted it out. The canvas was stiff with age but had done its job. She carefully unfolded the corners. Inside was a small, heavy iron box. It was rusted, but the clasp, a simple hinged hasp, was not frozen shut. With a bit of effort and the help of her chisel, she pried it open. The last light of the setting sun caught the contents, and for a moment she thought the box itself was on fire. It was filled to the brim with gold coins, heavy, lustrous discs of yellow gold, stamped with the image of a soaring eagle. Double eagles. A fortune. She stared, breathless, as the enormity of what she was looking at settled over her. This was more money than her uncle had likely seen in his entire life. Beneath the top layer of coins, her fingers found something else. A small book, its leather cover dry and cracked, but still intact. A ledger. She lifted it out, her hands reverent. She sat back on her heels, the heavy iron box in her lap, and opened the book. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown, but the handwriting was clear, elegant, and precise. The first page read, Elias Thorne. His ledger, May God have mercy on our souls. October 1848. She began to read, the words of a man dead for 90 years, speaking to her as clearly as if he were whispering in her ear. Elias Thorne was not just the cook. He was a quiet, wealthy man from the East, a widower who had lost his wife and 2 young sons to cholera. Heartbroken and seeking to build a new life far from the ghosts of his old one, he had financed the entire wagon train, gathering families who shared his dream of a new beginning in the West. He traveled as the cook because he enjoyed the simple, honest work, and it allowed him to observe the party without the pressures of leadership. His entries chronicled their journey, the births, the minor squabbles, the shared hopes around the nightly campfire. But a darker thread began to emerge. He wrote of his growing suspicion of the wagon master, a man named Corbin. He suspected Corbin was planning to lead them into an ambush, to kill the men and take the women, the wagons, and the considerable wealth Elias carried in the iron box. Elias, a careful and observant man, had decided to hide the expedition's funds. One night, under the guise of repairing the fire pit, he had dug the cache and secreted the box beneath the hearthstone. He had planned to confront Corbin the next day. He never got the chance. That night, the storm hit. A blizzard, sudden and unnaturally violent, descended upon them without warning. Elias described the wind as a screaming banshee, the snow so thick it was like a solid white wall. The temperature plummeted. He survived only because he was sleeping in the sturdy, well-built chuck wagon, huddled close to the residual warmth of the deep fire pit. The other families, in their less substantial prairie schooners, were not so fortunate. When the sun rose on a world of blinding white, he was the only one left alive. The ledger entries became frantic, filled with a grief so profound it seemed to bleed from the page. He had tried to bury the families, but the ground was frozen as hard as iron. He spent weeks there alone, a ghost in a city of the dead, before his own dwindling supplies forced him to leave. He made his way to the town of Redemption, a broken man. He had intended to return for the gold and to give the families a proper burial, but sickness took hold of him, a wasting fever that left him too weak to make the journey. The final entry was dated a year after the tragedy. His handwriting was shaky, the words sprawling across the page. To the one who finds this ground is not cursed, it is merely sad. The gold is yours. I have no kin, and the families who journeyed with me are all gone. My only request is that you do not let their memories be forgotten. Use this fortune to build something that lasts, a home, a life. Bring warmth back to this cold place. Give them the monument I never could. Let this not be a folly, but a foundation. May you find the peace here that I could not. Tears streamed down Alara's face, silent and hot in the cold night air. They were tears for the lost families, for the lonely grief of Elias Thorne, and for the profound, aching kinship she felt with this stranger across the decades. He too had been betrayed, had lost everything, and had been left alone to face an unforgiving world. His words were not just a message, they were a blessing, a purpose. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a steward. She carefully closed the ledger, wrapped it in the oilcloth with her plumb bob, and placed the iron box back in its stone-lined vault. She slid the heavy hearthstone back into place. That night, she built her first fire on top of it, the flames dancing over the hidden fortune. The warmth seeped into her bones, chasing away the chill of the evening and the deeper chill of her loneliness. She had a home, she had a purpose, and she had the means to see it through. The work began at dawn. With the ledger as her guide and the gold as her means, Alara's life took on a new, methodical rhythm. She did not touch the wagons in the circle. They were gravestones, monuments to the families Elias had written about. Instead, she would build her house nearby, on a small, flat piece of ground just outside the circle, where she could watch over them. She walked the 10 miles back to Redemption, her satchel light, her step firm. Her first stop was not the bank, but the blacksmith's shop. It was a dark, cavernous space that smelled of coal smoke, hot iron, and sweat. The blacksmith was a man named Ben, broad-shouldered and taciturn, his face permanently smudged with soot. He watched with a critical eye as she approached. "Need a horse shod?" he grunted, not pausing in his work. "No," Alara said. "I need to buy a stone hammer, a good set of masonry chisels, and an hour's use of your forge and anvil." Ben stopped hammering. He turned to face her fully, his expression a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "My forge? I need to retemper my grandfather's wood chisels. The edge is too brittle for the ironwood I'll be using." She spoke with the simple confidence of someone who knew her craft. She paid him for the new tools in cash, a few dollars from the $100 she had left. He watched, intrigued, as she fired up the secondary forge, her movements efficient and sure. She heated a chisel until it glowed cherry red, quenched it in oil, then tested the hardness with a file. She knew the colors of the steel, the precise moment of transformation. Ben said nothing, but his initial skepticism melted away, replaced by a grudging respect. He had seen countless drifters and dreamers pass through Redemption. He had never seen one who could temper steel. Her next stop was Martha's general store. Martha was a woman whose practicality was woven into her very being. She watched the comings and goings of the town with a sharp, discerning eye. Alara bought heavy canvas, sacks of cement, nails, rope, and dried provisions. She paid in cash. Martha asked no questions, but her gaze lingered on the quiet competence with which Alara selected her goods. The hardest part was arranging for transport. Ben, wiping his hands on an oily rag as she was leaving his shop, made an offer. "Where are you hauling this to?" "The old thorn plot," she said. He grunted. "The folly. What are you building out there? A monument to foolishness?" The question was gruff, but it lacked the mocking tone of the county clerk. "A house," she said simply. He chewed on that for a moment. "I've got a heavy wagon and a team. Be there at sunup tomorrow. My price is fair." It was not an offer of charity, but a business transaction between two competent people. It was the first crack in the wall of her solitude. True to his word, Ben arrived the next morning. Together they loaded the supplies. The journey was mostly silent, but it was a comfortable silence. When they arrived, Ben surveyed the circle of wagons, then the neat stack of tools and supplies Alara had already organized. He looked at the place she had marked out for her foundation, the lines straight and the corners perfectly square. He nodded once. "You know what you're about," he said. It was the highest compliment he could give. The days that followed blurred into a routine of hard, satisfying labor. Alara rose with the sun and worked until her muscles ached and her hands were raw. She quarried stone from a nearby outcropping, learning the unique character of the local granite. She dug the foundation, ensuring it was level and deep. She used her grandfather's plumb bob constantly, its brass point a pendulum of truth, ensuring every stone she laid was true to the center of the earth. She mixed mortar in a wheelbarrow, the process a familiar meditation. The house rose slowly, a testament to patience and skill. Jedediah, an old trapper who lived a solitary life in the hills, was the next to enter her orbit. He had been watching her for weeks from a distance, a silent observer. He'd seen her work, her tireless, methodical progress. One evening, he appeared at the edge of her campsite, a brace of rabbits in his hand. He was weathered and lean, his eyes holding the wisdom of one who speaks more with the landscape than with people. "Saw your smoke," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Figured you might be tired of beans." He laid the rabbits down. "You're building on hard ground, but it's honest ground." He pointed to a line of distant mesas. "When the clouds gather behind that peak, you have less than an hour before the rain hits, and the well Elias Thorne dug is over that rise. Still sweet if you clear it out." He offered not pity, but knowledge, the currency of survival in this land. He respected what she was doing, not just the building of a house, but the reclamation of a forgotten place. Elara, Ben, Jedediah, and Martha formed an unlikely, unspoken community. It was a community built not on social niceties, but on a foundation of mutual respect for competence. Ben delivered her supplies and sometimes stayed for an hour to help her set a particularly heavy lintel. Jedediah brought her game and news from the wider world, teaching her the subtle language of the high plains. Martha started setting aside the best supplies for her, trusting in the promise of the work she was doing. When Elara needed to convert a few of the gold coins into cash, she went to the next county, to a bank where she was a stranger, never revealing the source of her quiet wealth to her new allies. The gold was a tool, like her hammer, not a status symbol. One afternoon, the county clerk, Peterson, rode out on his horse. He had likely heard the rumors in town of the strange woman at the Folly. He probably expected to find a half-finished hovel and a defeated girl ready to abandon her foolish purchase. Instead, he saw the straight, strong walls of a stone house rising from the plains, the roof beams already being set. He saw Ben's wagon hitched nearby, and the blacksmith himself helping Elara hoist a heavy ridgepole into place. He saw the neatness of the worksite, the order and purpose in every action. He saw a project, not of desperation, but of profound and unshakable intent. He sat on his horse for a long time, the smirk wiped clean from his face, replaced by a look of baffled astonishment. He turned his horse and rode away without ever saying a word. His mockery had been silenced by the simple, irrefutable evidence of her work. Summer turned to autumn. The walls were up, the roof was on, and she was working on the interior. She used wood salvaged from the non-essential parts of the outer wagons, floorboards, side panels, wood that was seasoned hard as iron. She planed it by hand, its scent filling her small home. She built sturdy furniture, a table, a chair, a bed frame, her joinery neat and tight. The house was small, but it was perfect. It was a fortress of competence built against the wilderness and her own past. The first snow of winter was a light dusting, but it was a warning. Jedediah had noted the signs, the behavior of the animals, the color of the sky. A bad winter was coming. And then, one afternoon, the sky to the northwest turned a bruised, ugly color. The wind picked up, carrying not the scent of rain, but a terrifying, metallic cold. Jedediah had called it a blue norther, a storm that could drop the temperature 50 degrees in an hour. It was the same kind of freak weather system that had doomed the Thorne expedition, but this time there was a stone house with a solid roof and a warm hearth. This time there was a community. Ben had been on his way back to town when the storm hit, and he turned his team around and raced for the shelter of Elara's home. Jedediah, seeing the signs, had guided a family of new settlers, the Millers, whose sod dugout was in a low-lying area, toward the safety of her high ground. The fire Elara had built in her new stone fireplace roared, a beacon of defiance against the storm. The wind howled outside, a physical force that seemed to want to tear the world apart. Snow came down in a blinding, horizontal sheet. Inside the small stone house, there was warmth, light, and safety. Elara shared her food, the stores she had carefully laid in. Martha's provisions, Ben's strength, Jedediah's foresight, and her own labor had combined to create this sanctuary. Her house, the cook's folly, had become an ark. The gold from Elias Thorne bought the supplies, but it was the inheritance from her grandfather, the skills he had taught her, that had saved them all. The storm raged for 2 days. When it finally broke, the world was a silent, pristine expanse of white. The miller's dugout was completely buried, their livestock lost. Ben's wagon was safe in the lee of the house. They had all survived. In that moment, looking at the faces of the people gathered around her hearth, Alara understood the true meaning of Elias Thorne's request. Bring warmth back to this cold place. It wasn't just about a fire. It was about community. She had not just built a house. She had rebuilt a circle, one of living, breathing people. When spring finally came, melting the heavy snows, Alara knew it was time to fulfill the second part of her promise. She took a detailed list of the family names from Elias's ledger to Ben. She also took several of the gold coins. She asked him to forge a monument. Ben, who now understood the depth of her purpose, put his heart into the work. He forged a tall, simple iron marker, and on a bronze plate, he carefully stamped the names of every man, woman, and child who had died there. They erected it together, Ben and Jedediah and Alara, in the very center of the wagon circle, right next to the main fire pit. Alara cleared the circle of stones and scrub, and with seeds that Martha provided, she planted a garden of hardy wildflowers and prairie grasses. The skeletal wagons now stood guard over a place of life, not death. The Cook's Folly was no longer a name spoken with pity or derision. It was now simply the sanctuary. A year after she had first arrived, Alara sat on the small stone porch of her finished home. The evening air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers from her garden. The house felt like a living thing around her, solid, warm, and breathing. The wagon circle was a soft blur of color in the fading light, the dark shape of the iron monument, a silent, dignified sentinel at its heart. Jedediah was staying for supper, and the smell of roasting rabbit and herbs drifted from the open kitchen window. Ben was due to arrive the next day with a pane of glass for the last window, a luxury she had finally allowed herself. On the small, sturdy wooden table beside her chair sat two objects. One was her grandfather's brass plumb bob, its surface gleaming in the last rays of the sun, its point aimed unerringly at the core of the world. Next to it lay a single, gold double eagle, polished to a soft, deep luster, the image of the soaring bird, a promise of freedom and a new beginning. She had been given two inheritances, she reflected. One was a meager, insulting handful of cash from an uncle who saw value only in what could be sold. The other was an inheritance of knowledge, resilience, and truth, contained in the satisfying weight of a brass tool in her hand. The true fortune Elias Thorne had left her was not the gold, but the purpose. The gold was merely the means. The skills Silas had given her were the foundation. She had built a life not out of money, but out of stone and wood and iron, out of observation and competence, out of the respect of quiet people and the memory of those long gone. The $150 she had paid to a mocking clerk for a piece of worthless, haunted ground had bought her more than land. It had bought her a home, a community, and a profound, quiet peace that settled deep in her soul. It was, without a single doubt, the best money she had ever spent.